They say history is written by the victors, but more often it's remembered by the dreamers. When we think of the Middle Ages, what comes to mind? Noble knights in shining armour, gallant steeds galloping across green hills, stone castles silhouetted against golden sunsets, and of course fair maidens dropping handkerchiefs from balconies for love-struck poets below. It's a world many of us grew up imagining, through fairy tales, films, or Renaissance fairs with giant turkey legs and fake British accents. It feels grand, romantic, maybe even comforting. But here's the thing, that version of the Middle Ages, it's mostly fiction, lovingly embroidered over time like an old family quilt, stitched with just enough dragons and chivalry to keep things interesting. The truth, as it tends to be, was far less charming. For every knight on horseback there were hundreds of peasants trudging barefoot through the mud, hauling sacks of grain or worse, hauling someone else's grain. Castles? Beautiful, yes, but they weren't built for beauty. They were cold, damp and draftier than a screened-in porch in January. You didn't live in them because you were lucky, you lived there because someone might try to invade. And let's just say indoor plumbing hadn't RSVP'd to the 12th century yet. As for the gallant knight, well, he wasn't always the charming type. More often, he was the local enforcer for the noble class, trained to fight, not recite poetry. He might rescue you from a dragon, but only if the dragon owed taxes. And those beautiful gowns the ladies wore? Linen, wool, hot, heavy. And let's not even get started on what passed for deodorant back then. So why do we hold on to this gilded version of the past? Maybe because, deep down, we all want to believe there was once a simpler, nobler time, a time when love was pure, honour was real, and problems could be solved with a sword and a sonnet. But the real Middle Ages, they were complicated, and in many ways, that's far more fascinating than any fairy tale, because the people of the Middle Ages didn't just survive hardship, they built lives in the shadow of it. They loved, they lost, they hoped, just like we do. So, let's set aside the tiaras and the talking animals for a moment. Let's step through the castle gates and into the real story. Welcome to the Middle Ages. Not as we wish it had been, but as it truly was. For anyone born in the 20th century, birth is a story that begins in a hospital room. Bright lights, clean sheets, doctors in masks, and that miraculous sound of a baby's first cry. But in the Middle Ages, that same moment began in a small, smoky hut, surrounded not by doctors but by neighbours, midwives, and prayer. The air was thick with hope, fear, and the faint smell of burning herbs meant to keep away evil spirits. There were no antiseptics, no painkillers, no reassuring beeps of medical monitors, just faith, and maybe a wooden spoon to bite down on. Giving birth wasn't a celebration of new life, it was a battle between life and death. And the truth is, not everyone won. For women, childbirth was one of the most dangerous moments of their lives. No one spoke of maternal health. There was no epidural, no cesarean team waiting by. If something went wrong, the only thing left to do was pray. In some villages, a priest stood outside the birthing room, ready to baptize the child the moment it was born, sometimes before it had even taken its first breath. That wasn't superstition, that was practicality. Infant mortality wasn't an exception, it was an expectation. A third of all children never made it past their first birthday. Those who did faced a world that didn't make childhood easy. There were no baby cribs or lullabies playing on soft radios. A cradle, if you were lucky, was a wooden box stuffed with straw. Toys were stones, sticks, and the occasional chicken. And by age 5, most children were already working, feeding animals, fetching water, or scaring crows out of the fields. No one asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" The only dream was simply to grow up, and yet in those harsh beginnings, families still found moments of tenderness. A mother might carve a wooden rattle for her baby, a father might hum a tune learned from his own childhood. These small gestures of love were their only medicine against despair. When we look back from our modern world, it's hard to grasp just how thin the line between life and death once was. In the 1950s, a newborn could expect vaccines, clean water, and doctors who actually washed their hands. In the 1350s, a newborn was lucky just to see spring. But here's what makes their story remarkable. Despite the odds, people kept bringing children into the world. They kept hoping. They kept trying again after loss. That stubborn spark is what carried humanity forward, one fragile birth at a time. So the next time you see a photo of a medieval mother holding her child, don't just see a relic of the past. See courage, see faith, see love that refused to give up even when the world gave it every reason to. If you were an ordinary person in the Middle Ages, your life didn't begin with a sword, a scroll, or a crown. It began with mud. Mud in the fields, mud on your boots, mud on the floor of your home, which was also made of mud. Because for the vast majority, life wasn't lived in castles or cathedrals, it was lived on the land. You rose with the sun, whether you liked it or not, and you got to work. There was no such thing as a weekend, no PTO, no sleeping in. The rooster didn't care if it was your birthday, and the crops certainly didn't pause for anniversaries. Your day began in a small, smoke-filled cottage. It had a thatched roof, no chimney, and walls that sighed when the wind blew. In winter, the frost came inside. In summer, the flies did too. There was no heating unless you counted your own body heat, and maybe the cow you let sleep inside. No ventilation, except the holes in the walls and whatever smoke didn't decide to stay. Breakfast, if you were lucky, was yesterday's bread. If you were really lucky, there was a bit of onion or a smear of lard, and then it was out the door and into the field, ploughing, planting, weeding, harvesting. Farming wasn't a lifestyle, it was survival. The seasons weren't something you watched change through a window. They were your calendar, your paycheck, and your landlord, all rolled into one. Spring meant planting and praying. Summer meant sweating and swatting flies. Autumn meant harvesting with blistered hands. Winter meant hoping there was enough to get through it. And when the work was done, there was more work. Grain had to be milled, bread had to be baked, clothes had to be scrubbed in cold river water with soap made from animal fat. If that sounds romantic, try doing it with no gloves, no detergent, and a wind that could crack your skin by noon. Still, people found rhythm in the routine. Children laughed, neighbours helped. And when the bread came out warm and the sky turned pink behind the trees, you might just believe that life wasn't so bad after all. We often think of the past as simpler, but for the people who lived it, it was anything but easy. Every meal was earned, every roof patched with hands that trembled from cold or age or exhaustion. And yet they endured. Not because life was soft, but because they were strong. Stronger than they probably ever gave themselves credit for. Their stories weren't written in books or carved into stone. They were kneaded into loaves, sewn into shirts, and whispered in lullabies beside smoky hearths. So the next time you wonder what it means to live an ordinary life, remember this. The people who did the quiet daily work of keeping families fed and fires lit, they were never ordinary. They were the foundation of everything. If you were hungry in the Middle Ages, your options were limited. There were no corner diners, no supermarkets, no, sorry I forgot dinner, let's just order pizza. Every meal, no matter how small, was the result of backbreaking labour, unpredictable weather, and a bit of luck. And clean drinking water? Well, that was more of a luxury than a guarantee. The village stream might have looked picturesque, but upstream someone else's laundry, or livestock, was having a bath. In short, eating and drinking weren't just daily routines, they were acts of survival. Let's talk water. Fresh, clean, safe water was rare. Most people didn't even try. It wasn't that they didn't want to, it was that they didn't trust it. And for good reason. Water carried disease. And without any knowledge of germs or bacteria, folks just knew one thing. If you drank it raw, you got sick. Maybe not right away, but eventually. Sometimes fatally. So what did they drink? Beer. Yes, beer. And not just the men. Women drank it. Children drank it. Even monks who had taken vows of silence were probably toasting each other at breakfast. But this wasn't the kind of beer you're thinking of. It was low in alcohol, thick, cloudy, and about as filling as soup. Which was good, because soup might be all you had. The cornerstone of the medieval diet was bread. Dark, dense, and hearty, made from whatever grain was available. If the harvest was good, the bread was decent. If it wasn't, well, let's just say you learned to chew. Protein. That depended on your social rank and your luck. A boiled egg on Sunday was a small miracle. A piece of salted pork in winter? That was Christmas, and Thanksgiving rolled into one. Fresh vegetables were seasonal, if they grew at all. And fruit? If it wasn't growing on your land, it probably wasn't growing in your bowl. And then there was disease. When the streets were open, sewers and rats were your most frequent dinner guests, it's no surprise that illness spread like wildfire. Typhoid, dysentery, and other charming dinner companions visited regularly. There were no refrigerators, no hand-washing stations, and your cutting board was probably a rock. Yet somehow people kept going. They learned which herbs soothed the stomach. They shared what little they had. And when the bread came out of the oven, it was a victory. To eat in the Middle Ages wasn't just to nourish the body, it was to challenge the odds. Each bite was a product of hard labour, patience and hope. Each mug of beer was safer than the well. Each loaf of bread was a symbol that somehow, against all logic, life had made it another day. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't gourmet, but it was enough. And sometimes, when the fire was lit, the bread was warm and the air was still, it even felt like a feast. If you were sick in the Middle Ages, the good news was, everyone else probably was too. The bad news? There wasn't much anyone could do about it. Medicine as we know it today simply didn't exist. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no anaesthetic to dull the pain. Unless you count a strong ale and a really optimistic prayer, the human body was still a mystery. Doctors, or rather the people called doctors, did their best, but their best usually involved leeches, bleeding, or something that smelled suspiciously like goat fat. In short, catching a cold could end in tragedy, and a toothache could end in a eulogy. Medicine back then was based on what they called the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, that meant your humours were out of balance. How did they fix that? By removing some of them. Too much blood. They'd drain you. Too much bile. They'd purge you. Too much hope. Well, that wasn't really a medical condition. Hospitals did exist, mostly run by monks and nuns, but they were less like places of healing and more like waiting rooms for heaven. People didn't come to get better. They came to die with dignity. If you lived in the countryside, you might see a wise woman instead, a healer who knew herbs, roots and charms passed down through generations. She might give you a potion made of garlic and honey, or whisper a prayer over your fevered head. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but at least she cared. And then there was the plague. The year was 1347. Ships arrived from the east, carrying rats, and the rats carried fleas, and the fleas carried death. Within months, entire towns fell silent. The air filled with the sound of church bells, until even the bell ringers were gone. They called it the Black Death. It killed rich and poor alike, noblemen and farmers, priests and sinners. There was no understanding of infection, no way to stop it, only terror, prayer, and the slow tolling of time. People believed it was divine punishment, that God himself had grown weary of humanity's sins. Some whipped themselves in the streets, hoping pain might earn forgiveness. Others fled to the countryside only to carry the disease with them. The world felt like it was ending, and for nearly half of Europe it did. And yet, somehow, life continued. When the worst had passed, the survivors came back. They rebuilt their homes, retilled the soil, and buried their dead beneath the same earth that fed them. They didn't know why they had lived, but they did what humans always do. They endured. Medicine would take centuries to catch up. Centuries before anyone understood germs or discovered penicillin or learned that hand-washing could save lives. But even in that long, dark chapter, there was something profoundly human. The will to heal, even when healing seemed impossible. They didn't have science, they didn't have tools, but they had faith, and sometimes that was enough to make them try again tomorrow. In the Middle Ages, people didn't just live under the rule of kings or lords. They lived under the watchful eyes of heaven, and more immediately the ever-present gaze of the Church. From birth to death, and everything in between, the Church had a hand in it. Not a gentle hand, always, but a firm one. It baptized you, married you, forgave your sins for a small fee, and rang its bells when your time on earth was done. And it wasn't just Sundays. Every day, every season, every moment was tied to the rhythms of religion. The calendar was filled with saints' days and holy feasts. Even the planting of crops came second to the planting of souls in good standing. For the common folk, the Church offered comfort and community, but it also offered consequences. If you broke the rules, the punishment didn't just come from the local sheriff, it came from God's representatives on earth. Steal a loaf of bread? You might lose a hand. Lie under oath? You might be branded. Speak against the Church? Well, you'd better start packing for a very warm afterlife. Justice was public, loud, and meant to be unforgettable. Punishment happened in the village square, where everyone could see and hopefully learn not to make the same mistake. It wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about deterrence, and maybe a little entertainment. Meanwhile, the church wasn't just concerned with your actions, it was deeply invested in your thoughts. Doubt too much, ask the wrong questions, or read the wrong book, and suddenly you weren't a villager anymore. You were a heretic, and that label came with consequences far beyond this world. But for many, the church wasn't something to be feared. It was a place of light in a difficult world, a refuge for the soul, a reason to hope. The priest might have been the only man in the village who could read. The cathedral was the tallest, most beautiful building they had ever seen, and in a world full of uncertainty, the church offered certainty. This life may be hard, but the next one could be better if you followed the rules. Of course, not everyone started from the same place. If you were born a peasant, odds were good you'd stay a peasant. If you were born noble, your biggest concern might be getting your velvet wet in the rain. Social class wasn't just a matter of wealth, it was destiny sealed the moment you arrived. Upward mobility, that was for angels. And yet within those rigid lines, people still found meaning. They laughed, they loved, they prayed. They believed in something greater, not because it was forced on them, but because in a world full of toil and shadows, faith was the one candle that never went out. So yes, life was hard, the law was harsh, the church was powerful, but in the quiet moments, in the hush of a chapel, in the ringing of a distant bell, in the whispered prayer of a mother tucking in her child, there was peace. And sometimes, peace was enough. It's tempting to think of medieval warfare as something that happened far away, on distant battlefields between armoured knights under fluttering banners. The kind of thing you'd read about in epic poems or see carved into cathedral walls. But for most people in the Middle Ages, war wasn't a story. It was a sound in the distance. It was smoke on the horizon. It was the knock at the door that wasn't really a knock. Because war didn't ask for permission. It arrived unannounced, with torches, swords, and a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Life for the average villager already wasn't easy. Add to that the constant threat of raids, invasions, or local disputes turning bloody, and suddenly that muddy little cottage didn't feel so safe anymore. Kings went to war, lords picked fights, and peasants paid the price, usually in grain, livestock, or blood. And the enemy wasn't always foreign. Sometimes it was the nobleman from the next valley over, or bandits who'd heard your harvest went well. There were no warning sirens, no news alerts, just a shout in the night, and the hope that you had time to hide the children. When the king called, even ordinary men were expected to fight. Fathers, blacksmiths, field hands. They were handed spears, taught how not to stab themselves, and sent off in linen tunics to face armoured knights on horseback. Training was fast, sometimes just a few hours with a wooden stick and a man who used to be in the army, or said he was. If you survived your first battle, you were considered experienced. If you didn't, well, you weren't alone. And the battlefield itself? It wasn't glorious. It was noisy, terrifying, and muddy. Very muddy. Picture a dozen men in chainmail slipping and falling while trying to swing swords heavier than a sack of potatoes. Now add shouting, horses, arrows, smoke, and the very real smell of fear. It was chaos. It was brutal. It was war. Up close and very personal. Those who returned came back changed. Not just in body but in spirit. A limp here, a haunted stare there. Stories they didn't want to tell, and some they couldn't stop telling no matter how many years passed. Violence, in the Middle Ages, wasn't just part of life. It was life. It shaped laws. It built castles. It scarred families and rewrote borders. And through it all, ordinary people kept going. They fortified their homes with prayer and pitchforks. They built communities where no army could reach, not in muscle, but in memory. Because no matter how loud the swords clashed or how dark the smoke grew, people still found a way to sing, to sow, to start again. The Middle Ages weren't just an age of war. They were an age of survival, and the greatest victories weren't won on battlefields, they were won at the hearth, where life insisted on continuing, despite the fear, despite the fire, despite it all. Not everyone in the Middle Ages lived on a farm. Some people lived in towns, small, noisy, cramped places where chickens roamed the streets, people shouted from stalls, and the smell of fresh bread tried its best to overpower the smell of, well, everything else. Town life buzzed with movement. There were cobblers hammering soles, blacksmiths showered in sparks, and market criers who somehow never lost their voices. And at the heart of it all was the marketplace, a place where news travelled faster than wagons, where coins clinked, neighbours haggled, and fortunes rose or fell by the hour. This wasn't Wall Street, but it was busy, it was loud, and it was the lifeblood of small-town life. If you were lucky enough to be a skilled tradesman, you probably belonged to a guild. Guilds were part union, part club, part neighbourhood watch. They protected your craft, taught apprentices, and made sure nobody undercut prices, at least not too much. They also threw a pretty good feast once a year, as long as you didn't mind sharing the roast with half the town. Being a craftsman meant long hours. You made things by hand, slowly, carefully, and with pride. Every pot, every shoe, every horseshoe was a day's labour. There were no shortcuts, only skill, sweat, and stubbornness. And if you were a merchant, life was a different kind of exhausting. You travelled from town to town, your wagon packed with cloth, spices, or salted fish. You braved potholes, rain, thieves, and the occasional very grumpy customs officer. Trade routes wound like veins through Europe, connecting tiny villages to distant ports and cities, and while the roads were bad and the inns were worse, the hope of a good sale kept you going. But make no mistake, town life didn't mean you were rich, not unless your last name came with a title and maybe a few extra acres of someone else's land. Because in every town, the line between the haves and the have-nots was crystal clear. The noble family dined behind stone walls with silver cutlery, while the rest of the town shared soup and stories, hoping the landlord wouldn't raise the rent again. Economic mobility. It existed technically, but it was about as smooth as a dirt road in February. You could work hard, save coins, build a shop, maybe even buy a better roof. But breaking into the world of nobility, that took more than money. It took bloodlines, and the right kind of blood. Still, towns offered something precious: momentum. They were places of energy, of exchange, where ideas and goods passed from hand to hand, and where a clever mind had at least a chance to rise. And on market day, when the stalls were open, the air smelled of spiced apples and wood smoke, and music played from a flute someone had carved in winter. Life felt full of possibility. Yes, the gap between rich and poor was wide. But in the bustle of the town square, with laughter ringing and feet dancing on cobblestones, you could almost forget how steep that climb really was. Almost. In the grand stories of the Middle Ages, men tend to steal the spotlight. Kings, knights, monks, warriors, swinging swords and making speeches. But while the history books marched off to war, someone had to stay behind and keep the world from falling apart. More often than not, that someone was a woman. Now, let's be honest. Medieval society wasn't exactly what you'd call progressive. It was a man's world, and a heavily armoured one at that. Laws were written by men, land was owned by men, and power was passed down through beards and bloodlines. But if you think that means women weren't essential, you haven't looked closely enough. A woman's life in the Middle Ages was often decided before she could even speak. She would grow up to be a wife, a mother, a worker, or, for the few who had the choice, a bride of Christ. For many, marriage wasn't about love. It was about land, dowries, and keeping peace between families. And once married, a woman's world revolved around hearth and home. She managed the food, the fire, the fabric. She raised the children, milked the cow, mended the clothes, and kept her household running like a small kingdom, only without the throne, the jewels, or the help. In farming families, she worked the fields alongside her husband. Sun up to sun down, hands in the soil, heart in the home. And when illness came or war took the men away, she kept the farm going on her own. In towns, some women became brewers, bakers, or midwives. They carried knowledge passed down through generations, often healing with herbs and instincts when doctors gave up. Some even ran businesses, especially widows, who had a bit more freedom and a lot more work. And then there were the women who chose a different path, the convent. Becoming a nun wasn't always a calling, sometimes it was the only option. But inside the quiet walls of the abbey, some women found something rare: education, purpose, and even influence. Abbesses could run entire communities. They wrote, taught, copied books, and preserved knowledge through centuries of chaos. In a world where most women couldn't read, some nuns were writing history by candlelight. And speaking of history, a few women broke the mould completely. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of 2 nations, mother of kings, and no stranger to diplomacy or drama. Or Hildegard of Bingen, the visionary nun who composed music, wrote about medicine, and lectured bishops like they were her students. And Joan of Arc, a teenage girl who claimed she heard voices from heaven, led armies into battle and faced her death with more courage than the men who condemned her. Their stories were rare, but they were real. The truth is, women in the Middle Ages weren't silent figures in the background. They were weavers, not just of cloth, but of family, faith, and survival. Their hands built homes, their hearts held villages together, and their voices, though often unwritten, still echo beneath the surface of history. They lived under laws they didn't make, within systems they couldn't change. But they carved out lives anyway, full of strength, tenderness, and quiet defiance. So the next time someone says life was simpler back then, ask them who was holding it all together, because chances are it was a woman. In the Middle Ages, people didn't need to be reminded that life was short. They lived the reminder. Every cough could be a warning, every fever could turn final, and every morning you woke up was, in its own quiet way, a kind of miracle. The average person lived just 30 to 40 years, and that was if you made it past childhood, which many didn't. But despite the constant closeness of death, or maybe because of it, people didn't run from the idea. They lived with it. They talked about it. They even planned for it, sometimes more carefully than we plan our vacations. In their world, death wasn't a surprise. It was a neighbour. You saw death in the fields, where a bad harvest could mean an empty winter. You heard it in the churchyard, where bells rang not just for weddings, but for every soul laid to rest beneath the stone. You even smelled it in the streets, where disease moved faster than news, and the plague cart made its rounds without ceremony. And yet the people of the Middle Ages didn't despair. Not most of them. Because death to them wasn't just an ending, it was a crossing. Religion didn't just help them make sense of suffering, it gave it shape, meaning, even purpose. If you suffered in this life, perhaps it meant your soul was being purified for the next. If you gave to the poor or confessed your sins, perhaps heaven would welcome you with open arms. And if you didn't? Well, there were other arrangements. Hell wasn't a metaphor. It was a real place, vividly imagined in stained glass and sermons, filled with fire, demons, and enough guilt to keep even the most stubborn sinner up at night. But so was heaven, a place of light and peace, where suffering ended and loved ones waited. People prepared for death with rituals and reverence. A priest would come, a final prayer was said, and the soul was sent off like a traveller going home. They called it ars moriendi, the art of dying well. And in that art there was strange beauty, a sense that the end wasn't a failure, but a part of the story, a chapter that would be read again, somewhere beyond the veil. It's easy, from the comfort of today, to look back and feel sorrow for their short lives, to wonder how they faced so much loss with so little help. But perhaps the better question is, how did they face it with such grace? They mourned, they prayed, they buried children, parents and friends, sometimes all in the same year. But they also lit candles, they sang hymns, they told stories around the fire, passing down memory like a sacred torch. And through it all, they held on to one great hope, that life was not the end of life. In a world of brief years and long winters, faith became the bridge, a way to carry love forward, even after the body could go no further. So no, they didn't fear death the way we do. They respected it, they prepared for it, and when it came, they met it with open eyes and open hands, because for them the end was never the end. It was simply the beginning of forever.